the subject of this interview. Professor Sir Michael Howard was born in 1922, educated at Wellington College and Christchurch, Oxford. His studies were interrupted by war service with the Coldstream Guards. He won the Military Cross in Italy and was also wounded. He has held 4 university chairs at King's College London, 2 at Oxford, and finally at Yale, and has recently retired. We shall be discussing his publications later, so suffice it to say that he has done more than any other individual in the English-speaking world to foster military history and war studies. I met Michael first in 1959 through the good offices of Sir Basil Littlehart. I did my postgraduate research with him at King's College London and was recruited by him to the department in 1966. We have cooperated on various projects since then. Looking back, Michael, it may seem obvious to other people that you were born to be a military historian, but I think things didn't work out quite so simply as that.
No, it was, as with so many people's careers, it was a result of pure accident. My speciality at Oxford, where I studied under Hugh Trevor Roper and Keith Filing at Christchurch, was early modern English history. And I was recruited as an assistant lecturer at King's College London in 1947 to do precisely that. However, before I joined the staff at King's College, I had produced a work of military history, which was the war history of the regiment in which I served. I was recruited to do that by the regimental authorities because I was a historian and I was at the time at a loose end. And that gave me a certain interest in the writing of military history, a certain interest in military affairs. But nonetheless, I went back to being, as I thought, a straightforward English constitutional historian. But a few years later, in 1953, the University of London decided that they wanted to revive a obsolete, a defunct post in military history, which had existed, in military studies, which had existed before the war. And they decided that rather than get in some immensely distinguished retired soldier to do it, which was what had been the habit up till then, they would find what was hopefully a promising young academic who showed a certain amount of interest and invite him to develop the subject. At the time, my research had run very much into the soil. I was lost interest rather in what I was doing, and this was, I thought, a marvelous opportunity to develop a new subject virtually from scratch. And I jumped at it and never regretted it.
And of course I remember days shortly after that military history then was still rather unpopular in universities, but there wasn't a great deal of it being taught compared with now, when it really has become a growth industry. So obviously you were in at the very start.
It was then what one would now call operational history, almost pure and simple.
Yes.
The history of armed forces in war and the conduct of war. And I began at a time when, as a result of the Second World War experience, it was generally realized that it was a great deal more than that.
Sure.
And the senior authorities at the University of London who were responsible for setting up this chair, among them Sir Charles Webster, a diplomatic historian, Lionel Robbins, an economist, Keith Hancock, official historian of the British economy at war, got hold of me and said, what we want you to do is to develop the study of war in the round. By all means, focus upon military affairs, but we do want you to realize there's a lot else to it involved. And with their sage advice, I then did broaden my sights fairly considerably and changed the subject, the title of the subject, from military studies to war studies, which I'm glad to say it still is in the department in which you are teaching.
Yes, over the years we've had 1 or 2 crises when wars seem to be very unpopular with certain elements in the universities, and there was talk of changing it to some euphemistic title, but I'm very glad to say I agree with you that we do study war, and that's what we should call ourselves without being ashamed of it. If we could go back a little to your student days at university, most of us owe a great deal to some inspiration, some individual who has really started us on the path. I wonder if you'd care to reflect on your time at Oxford in that context.
Well, I was set on the path of history itself at a very, very early age. I'd always wanted to be a historian. I can't remember particularly why, but I remember at the age of about 6 or 7,
Yes.
I wrote a short play about the execution of Charles I. I was, however, at school I was taught by 1 or 2 superb masters who really whetted my appetite. At Oxford, as I said, Keith Filing, the Nestor of 17th century historians as it then was, and his pupil, Hugh Trevor-Roper, who took me on, who I think was the person I was closest to in my earlier years. He was always enormously kind and supportive through many difficult years. And he taught me what I think is one of the most important things in historians, how important it is to write good English, how important it is to be readable, to write reasonably elegantly so that people enjoy what they're reading.
I think he was a splendid model, still is of course, in terms of his lecturing and his writing, and without flattering you at all, I think this is one of your very great assets, that all you write is extremely readable. And this is something that is so often lost to view, I think, with researchers who are very good scholars, but really don't put over their ideas in such a way as to interest the wider public, as distinct from a few specialists who have to read what they've written.
Well, I also, I suppose, learned to write because I started in, I won't say journalism exactly, but book reviewing.
Yes, quite.
Again, at a fairly early stage.
A very important discipline, I think.
A very important discipline. Indeed. And when I began, war memoirs were starting to pour out in a sort of
weekly,
huge flood.
Yes.
And a friend of mine, somebody who taught me at Wellington, Cuthbert Worsley, who was then literary editor of the New Statesman.
T.C. Worsley, yes.
That's right.
Yes, indeed.
And he was utterly bored with the idea of military affairs, and he was delighted to find somebody who was prepared to review books.
Yes.
And I started reviewing for the Statesman. They went on to review for the Observer and went on to review for the Sunday Times, until eventually I was really writing a review a week.
Yes,
over
it can be rather stultifying.
It can be stultifying, but it is good for you.
Yes, it makes you
really
read quickly. And
it makes you have to read the books.
You mentioned earlier that you didn't take a doctorate, you did a little research, but formally it didn't lead to a higher research degree. But I think you would say that your equivalent in research and writing really made your name was your study of the Franco-Prussian War, which won the Duff Cooper Memorial Prize in 1961. Tell me how you came to tackle that subject and really what it meant to you in the broader context of your development.
Well, you're quite right. I didn't take a doctorate. I was the last generation of scholars who was able to get a university post without the meal ticket of the doctorate.
Of course, me too, as you know.
You were, I'm glad to say, who was hangover from it.
Yes.
And the first thing that I had to do when I went to London was to start lecturing on subjects utterly remote, or at least fairly remote from my own interests. I was put on to lecturing about European history from 1750 to 1914, not English history, at the beginning of the Civil War. Yeah. So the research which I was starting on doing, which was on certain individuals in the Long Parliament, was put on hold when while I gained a thorough mastery, so far as possible, of European history in the 18th and 19th centuries, which I found, on the whole, a great deal more interesting. Then I was briefed to become a military historian, and I was a little doubtful where I would begin, or rather where I would end. Should I focus upon the Napoleonic period, or on the 20th century, or what? And so I decided to choose something in between. The Franco-Prussian War, which I think I can say at that stage was not regarded as a very serious war, but seemed to me to be the saddle point between
pivotal point really in the 19th century,
between 18th century warfare, which reached its apogee in Napoleon, war in the sort of craftsman's era, and industrial warfare of the 20th century.
Yes, indeed.
And by examining the way in which the Franco-Prussian War was fought, I thought I'd be able to see how and why the conduct of war changed.
Yes.
But I discovered it did a great deal more than that. It taught me the importance of civil-military relations, the relationship between Bismarck and von Moltke. And at that moment, Gordon Craig had produced his superb book on the politics of the Prussian army, which had an enormously formative influence on me. The importance also of culture in warfare, the difference between the culture of the French elites and the culture of the Prussian elites.
Sure.
The impact of technology on warfare, the element of popular participation, conscription, volunteers, everything in a way was there. And it provided for me, as you quite rightly say, the kind of taproot which somebody else's thesis might do, but it was a taproot which broadened out into so many other subjects that I barely really knew where I was going to go from there. Now, if I'd been left to myself, I would probably then have ploughed on to 1914, looking at the way in which military affairs developed during that period. As it was, I wasn't left to myself. I was asked by Sir James Butler to take on a volume in the official history of World War II. And I then found myself plunged into archival research of the British conduct of the war. And that got me interested in World War II and in Britain and the British conduct of the war and civil military relations there as well. Shall I go on as well?
No, I think we might come back to, in fact, I think we should come back to your work on the two official history volumes that you did in a broader context later. But I think we should come to the big name of Clausewitz, the presiding genius of our field of study. I think he's been a big influence in your career. I'd like to ask how you first encountered him. I think that's implicit in what you said a moment ago. But to add, what particularly interested you when you first came across his great work?
Well, I was put on, the man who told me you better read Clausewitz was the then Professor of History of War at Oxford, Cyril Forbes. He said two books which you ought to read. One, it was the recently appeared collection of essays by Edward Mead Earle, Makers of Modern Strategy, which was enormous.
Yes, a classic, really, yes.
Showed one the range one had to cover. And he said, well, you better read Clausewitz. And I thought I'd better read Clausewitz, which I did with great reluctance.
You read him, if I may interrupt you, in the three-volume...
I read him in the three-volume, exactly, which was not the most scintillating translation. And I very rapidly saw the point. Well, there are so many points in Clausewitz. But the point which grabbed me particularly was what he had to say about friction in war. What in the army, as you know, one got to know as Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. And I'd never seen that sort of idea expressed in a highly intellectual form as it was there. And my brief experience of war had convinced me that this was really the essence of war. It was utter, total confusion in the middle, everything going on. And he seized on this as being the really significant point about war. Much more significant, I think, really, than his famous thing about war being an instrument of policy. And so I realized here's a man who really knows what he is writing about and is worth studying. And started making him the focus of my teaching at King's. Now, with you, one of my first graduate students was Peter Paré.
Indeed, yes.
And Peter went back to Princeton and interested Princeton University Press in the idea of doing a complete edition of all Clausewitz's works, which never actually happened. But they did ask me to undertake the translation of On War itself, and that occupied 4 or 5 best years of my life. And the thing which I think is probably I'm proudest of having done was people are going to go on reading that long after.
And this was a true joint effort with Peter Paré. It was a very interesting collaboration, I think. I think you'd concede that Peter is, in a sense, the great, one of the great Clausewitz scholars, whereas your range has been, been wider.
He has lived with Clausewitz, and his great book on Clausewitz and the State is a wonderful piece of work. And in the translation, my knowledge of German is run-of-the-mill. His knowledge of German is superb. And the way in which we handled it was that he would translate from the German and say, this is roughly what it means in English. And I would then try to put it into reasonably elegant and concise English.
Well, I think thousands of readers, maybe more than that, are very grateful to you for that. And perhaps that would lead me to ask, I think it's fairly clear that your translation does now hold the field and is sold pretty well. This means that people must be reading it somewhere, and one wonders who they are and what it is that they're getting from
Well,
it.
I'm delighted to say they are. I still get sort of fairly handsome royalty
Yes,
from the University Press every year for it. And the people who are reading it are mainly, up till now, have been officers in the United States Armed Forces.
Less in our forces, I rather suspect.
Less in our forces, I rather
They need a
suspect.
précis,
I
I
don't
think.
think that officers in our forces read a great deal.
I think they need a
The mass of
10-page
them.
précis on war, I think, really. To,
Well, that's another matter, perhaps. When they're good, they're very, very good. When
Yes.
they're learned, they're very, very learned. But in the United States, which really does take military education
Yeah.
extremely seriously,
yeah.
Clausewitz is absolutely at the center of all their studies.
Yes, yes.
And one can see the degree it is if one examines some of the statements in the philosophy of General Colin Powell, both at the time of the Gulf War and at the time of his refusal to get involved in Bosnia. He constantly is quoting Clausewitz and saying that war is the instrument of policy. What is the policy? That Clausewitz said nobody goes to war, or nobody in their senses go to war unless they know what they mean to achieve by it. And Colin Powell turning around to the White House and saying, what am I meant to achieve by this?
Yes, I'm afraid you would surely agree there's a great deal in Clausewitz that one can grab at, you know, for sort of public statements.
Oh, I
and
know.
Colin Powell also the other evening was quoting the decisive element in that Clausewitz stresses, decisive battle, which is rather alarming as regards Bosnia. This is another story, I think, but decisive battle through air power in such a situation was
Well,
frightening.
another fascinating thing about Clausewitz is the way in which different generations
Exactly,
have read
yes, I was
totally
going to
different
ask you
things
about that.
into him.
Yes.
That the Germans at the beginning of the 19th
Yes.
century saw him as a great apostle of violence and of battle and of
Willpower,
willpower,
morale.
precisely all
Yes.
that, which is within Clausewitz became a rather hate figure
Yes.
for British liberal historians
Yes.
like our own mentor
Quite.
Basil Littlehart, who
Indeed.
read it, said Clausewitz, the
Indeed.
Mahdi of mass.
I'm afraid, despite your work and Peter Parry and others, Clausewitz is one of those great figures who will always be quoted either out of context or quoted glibly by people who haven't really read him at all. But this is something we have to...
The same as so of Kant or of
Indeed.
Hobbes
Yes.
or any,
Yes.
any great thinker.
I've often thought of you as a Clausewitzian. Now, of course, that's a label, and no one likes to have a label attached to them. But I wonder if you would broadly go along with that.
I don't know what it means. If it means that I believe in violence, no. If it means that I believe that violence, if it is used at all, should be used very, very carefully controlled by the political leaders, yes.
Well, if I may interrupt, I was thinking
yes.
too that the view that international relations, interstate relations, are still very tenuous. They are still motivated by friction. War is a possibility. We know there are parts of the world where conventional war is very unlikely to occur, but the world is still a harsh place. I think that I have in mind your inaugural, I think it was in London, we talked about the causes of war, and I thought this was a very Clausewitzian view, that the world is still a very harsh place where we should be aware of not letting our weapons rust.
I think I would say I was a Hobbesian rather than a Clausewitzian in that.
That's even darker, I think.
That we are still, I'm afraid, in a state of nature. And if we're not very careful, life is nasty, poor, solitary, brutish and sort. And one has got to organise oneself in that awareness.
Indeed. I think we shall not have time to discuss all your books in detail.
Good.
I think that would be a bit of a plod through a large list. But I know that several of them have either been commissioned for a particular purpose or have resulted from distinguished lecture series, the Ford lectures at Oxford and so on. And if we could leave aside for the moment the official history, which we might come on to in a moment, would you care to say which of the others you're most satisfied with or proud of, if that's the right term?
The one which, oh heavens, the one I'm least satisfied with was the Continental Commitment, which I should have devoted a great, they were my Ford lectures.
Yes.
And most people who give Ford lectures very sensibly wait for 4 or 5 years and write them up and make them into much bigger books. I didn't. I think that it would have been quite a good book if I had given myself the time thoroughly to research it. As it was too much of a quickie, but it has been useful. The same applies to the Trevelyan lectures, War of the Liberal Conscience, which was, I think, what I enjoyed doing most, because that was marrying two of my great interests. One political thought, and the other the nature and conduct of war. And Trevelyan, being A liberal, B a military history buff, was the obvious focus for that. Now that again was a scamper through liberal attitudes towards war from Erasmus to A.J.P. Taylor or to E.P. Thompson, if you like, which I found very enjoyable, which I think was quite useful, but again I ought to have got my head down and done a lot more serious, heavy work on it.
On the other hand, you could say that these very stimulating surveys have left scope for other more dogged researchers like myself to chip away at.
I think it probably gets people hooked, gets them interested.
Indeed, and leaves some room for research students and so on.
I think the thing which I'm probably proudest of, well, the thing which I'm proudest of is Franco-Prussian War, which I enjoy doing enormously, and which I reread with great pleasure. I think, my God, what genius I had then. I would never be able to do that again.
But it's nice to reread something you've written a long time ago and think, that's pretty good, or could I do that now?
No, I could not. But the war in European history, which still sells extremely well, and was a very, very difficult. That was the most difficult book.
Yes, to compress such a great sweep into a very small span.
But it has been translated into the most extraordinary languages.
Yes,
and still is, I think, read fairly widely.
We hope there won't be an additional chapter necessary for that.
It won't be by me.
No, well, I mean, the war would have priced itself out in Western Europe, if not in other parts. Perhaps.
Western Europe, how far west?
Oh, quite. Yes. If we could just go back for a moment to the book on the liberal conscience, which I think you're particularly proud of that, and justifiably so. A colleague the other day, without being prompted, said he thought that was the most interesting of your books. It was very interesting remark. I imagine you really came from the sort of liberal, upper middle class families around the later 19th, early 20th century, very much espoused the views that really you examined there, the views that with the spread of trade and goodwill, better international cooperation, with a moral injection of moral righteousness, international affairs could somehow be run better. But then the military historian in you and the man who's fought in a war would perhaps tell you that, that it doesn't work out.
The events of the world showed me that. No, you're quite right. I mean, my father's family were of Quaker origin, and I had a lot of old Quaker aunts who were absolutely appalled at my joining the army. And from that side of the family, I did have this Irenist, Cobdenite approach.
Yes.
My mother's family were German Jewish immigrants who were born into this sort of wealthy international bourgeoisie who did believe that the world was getting better, that as wealth increased, so international community was growing. And that combination did make me a natural liberal wet, which I am still a natural liberal wet. I mean, I have which is why I had such problems about dealing with the campaign for nuclear disarmament.
Yes, we might come to that.
Sympathy is entirely on their side. I mean, my whole emotions on their side. I mean, my culture is on my side. If one, but alas, as you say,
but this is where Clausewitz, I think, comes in, and Hobbes, and tells you
the realist school of international relations.
But it's remarkable how the liberal conscience has really continued to flourish, in the sense. I mean, the First World War was a terrible knock to international cooperation, but then again in the 20s, the quest for disarmament, faith in the League of Nations. But even today, there's a sort of moral itch, as I think, whether you said, but a moral itch to reform the world, which can, however noble in sentiment, can lead to rather disastrous results in the field. I was thinking of various trouble spots in the world.
Bosnia,
yes,
I
indeed.
know at the moment, exactly. But I think the itch to reform the world is highly desirable and necessary, and that I think that I'd say, rather than Clausewitzian, I'm a Kantian. That believing in conflict as, alas, somehow built into the system because of the rotten wood, the warped timbers that we're made of, but nonetheless believing that one is going on through these struggles to sort of higher levels.
It's useful if the desire to put the world straight is also allied to the capacity to do it, rather than
and the acceptance of the limits of what one can do.
Absolutely.
I think is the important realization.
I think we're moving on there to something I'm very interested to ask you, and that's the broader attitudes and beliefs that permeate your work. I think to some extent you've just been talking about that, but I think it will strike the reader that you've kept clear of any party affiliation. You have no party label. You occasionally appear to be tough-minded, as I mentioned in your inaugural in London about the causes of war, but I think never militaristic in the sense of saying that war was a good thing. The general tone of your work, I think, is analytical, judicious, rather than prescriptive. Does that all seem a fair description?
It sounds very, very kind. I think I'd characterize myself by saying that I have great respect and sympathy for the people, irrespective of party, who have responsibility for doing things.
Yes.
This, I think, is not always the case with academics. That I have admiration for fonctionnaires, for civil servants, for diplomats, for soldiers, for generals, for politicians, who do bear these crushing responsibilities.
Yes.
And if they do, on certain occasions, I have been asked to help or advise over particular issues.
Yes.
Dennis Healy, for example, invited me to help over military organisation of military education. I was delighted to do that. There were occasions when, astonishingly, Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was, invited my advice on
known
various
to be an
things.
admirer of your work,
and I was absolutely happy and pleased to give it.
Yes.
I mean, whoever they were, if these are people with terrifying responsibilities, and if I can help them, I'm only too glad to do it.
Sure.
Now, I don't think that is a party affiliation, but I think it does mean that I respect people who have the burden of power.
Yes. The more critical word, you said I was kind, but the more critical word would be that you're an establishment figure. You're not an iconoclast.
I would not deny that I have always worked, as it were, from within, inside the establishment.
Yes.
And it's partly my upbringing, the school I went to, the university I went to, the regiment I went into, and everything. I am what I am.
Yes.
And I am not an outside iconoclast, sort of like radical, like E.P. Thompson genuinely was.
Quite.
Honourable, honest man.
Yes.
And like Alan Taylor tried to be and pretended that he was, although
sort of
I think
conservative radical or radical conservative. But you're more conservative with a small c, I think.
Again, I don't like these parties.
Well, this is not a party label. I mean, this is
a
a conservative with a very small c, of someone who, on the whole, sees how things have worked. And
I think conscious of the limits to what can be done.
Yes, indeed.
The more one examines the state of the world, and the way in which the world has always worked.
Yes. You mentioned just now the work you did for military education. This was the Howard English inquiry, which fell on stony ground, I think. We needn't pursue that today particularly. But you did a survey of the structure of the MOD, Ministry of Defence, which I think did lead to more constructive, rather large-scale changes.
I think it did.
You've been involved in other, we could call them public or official organisations. You were in at the start of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a founder member of that, I think. And as we mentioned in passing, you've been involved in 2 official history volumes, one of the Grand Strategy volumes on 1942-43, and the volume of Deception in the Intelligence series. We won't go into all the details of these unless you particularly want to, but what I wanted to ask you was, clearly in some ways these have been a distraction from writing more substantial works of history, but on the positive side I imagine they've given you insights into the working of the official mind, the problems of telling the truth even in a democracy, the limits of what can be published, and so on. So probably the pluses might be more than the minuses in the long run, do you think?
Well, I think so. I mean, I very much doubt whether I'd have written any more substantial works of history if I hadn't done those. But yes, it showed me how government worked, which was the
difficulty of getting things through the apparatus. You might have a good idea, but how do you get it implemented?
The levels at which decisions get taken.
Yes.
the comparatively limited influence of apparently great men.
Yes.
One of the things which I did discover in writing the official history of grand strategy was the extent to which Churchill, who was believed to have actually formulated strategy with his out of his own head, did not. That he was really quite often putting his chop on a strategy which had been worked out by his military advisors, quite often at a fairly low level.
Yes.
And the ideas seeping upwards.
Yes.
And then Churchill occasionally coming forward with his own idiosyncratic concepts, and the conflict between his ideas and the ideas coming up. Almost always the ideas coming up was actually one.
Yes. This is where there tends to be a gap between the serious scholar who has really looked into the archives and how decisions are made, or into the workings of them at first hand, and the more popular writer who tends to just label all the decisions, good or ill, and usually ill, as Churchillian, and then he gets
this is where documentary research really is absolutely essential.
Yes, and the knowledge that you acquired through working in the Cabinet Office and seeing how decisions were actually reached. I think it's quite a small step from that question to the fact that you've been a regular commentator on current international affairs, particularly with a strategic element, but not only that. And of course you've lived through the Cold War. On that subject, I think you're always sceptical of the utility of nuclear weapons. Indeed, you engaged in a public debate with someone who seemed to argue that nuclear war, if it came, could actually be won. You strongly disagreed with that. But you've been equally sceptical and wary of the goal which some idealists have set of complete disarmament. You've written a very strong expose of the perils of a disarmed world. I think you've urged restraint on both extreme views of fighting a nuclear war or aiming for complete disarmament. And I think if I had to draw a moral from a number of your writings and lectures and so on about the nuclear era, which I hope is behind us, is that a nuclear war was not inevitable, as so many Jeremiahs said, and that things might improve, as on this level at least they have done, I think, in the last few years. And I wonder, I think it may be a fairly obvious question, but whether being a historian and a commentator on current affairs seem to mesh together quite well, in that the sense of history enable you to take perhaps a more informed but also a more detached view of crises as they occurred.
Well, I was able to turn from one to the other without any real sense of changing gear. Almost the moment that I was appointed to the lectureship in military studies in 1953, the first thermonuclear weapons were exploded. And I then found myself being asked from people in Fleet Street, just down the road from King's. They discovered that there was a new lecturer in military history. He must know about nuclear weapons. And they rang me up and asked me. I didn't know any more than they did, but I had to find out. And I thus found myself one of the first as were gurus on this matter, and rapidly made contact with the American specialists in the field, and all my thinking and talking with them did evolve, I suppose, a certain attitude as you have described it. Certainly never thinking of nuclear war as being inevitable. Inevitability is not a historical concept.
No, one shouldn't use the word at all.
One shouldn't use the word at all.
One only knows it's inevitable because it's happened.
But I think two things affected my attitude. One was that I did believe that we were dealing in the Soviet Union with a fairly ruthless power, which did not have any kind of inhibitions about the utility of any kind of power to protect its interests and to advance them. Possibly no worse than anybody had been in the past, us in the 18th century, if you like. Not very much better, but one could not pretend they were not there.
No,
and it got to be dealt with. But secondly, the Clausewitzian Murphy's Law factor, the appalling danger of things going wrong. And what used to worry me very much talking to people who really did know about the planning for the use of nuclear weapons was their total ignorance of this factor, of the contingent factor, of accident, And this again is something which a historian has always
Indeed.
more conscious of, the part which accident, which
Yes.
is unforeseen.
Yes.
And the failure to include in their plans any kind of provision for that.
Yes.
And I was always very conscious of the danger of
Yes.
I won't say accidental war, because wars aren't accidental, but of things going wrong once war did begin. The uncontrollability of war.
I suspect or sense that there was a moral interest in all this too. It wasn't just a detached historian, that you felt concern about the threat of nuclear war. And I wonder if your involvement in this was to some extent motivated by religious faith, or was that something quite separate?
Well, I suppose it might be. I mean, I am a committed Christian.
Yes.
And member of a body called Christian Approaches for Arms Control, and have had to try to reconcile, really ever since adolescence, Christianity with the
Yes.
conduct of war, whether
Indeed.
nuclear or any other.
Yes.
It is a dimension which is there, which
Sure.
I cannot totally exclude.
Right.
And I've always been a little impatient with other Christians, like Bruce Kent, who I've crossed swords
Yes,
with, who
indeed.
said, "Oh no, I am a Christian, and
Yes,
because I
yes.
believe that nuclear war is bad, Christians must believe
Yes.
nuclear war is bad." I mean, the one thing that a history of Christianity does show
Yes.
is that it is possible to be a Christian and hold all kinds of appalling beliefs.
Yes,
appalling
indeed.
in the eye
Yes.
of liberals. And so many of
Yes.
beliefs which now are thought to be
Yes.
Christian are in fact simply liberal beliefs,
Yes. Yes.
which would have been spurned by Christians
Quite.
in the Middle Ages.
No names, no pack drill, as they say,
Well,
but
it's-
some deeply religious people thereby
Yes.
appear to have a self-righteous view that because they have deep faith, they somehow have insight which historians or other plodding professionals lack, and that you jolly well ought to listen to what they have to say.
Oh, that's right, yes. But
but-
other people are always self-righteous. One is never self-righteous oneself.
Well, I think standing outside all this, one can point the finger, but without mentioning names. I'd like to move towards the conclusion of this interview by asking you probably 3 questions about your valedictory lecture at Oxford, which was titled Structure and Process in History, but I can assure our viewers that it's much more interesting than the abstract terms of structure and process might lead one to think. You argue strongly that historians should have a sense of process and development in the work that they're doing, even if not of progress, which now is a slightly less convincing word than it was to our grandfathers. But I wonder if this view is compatible, or if it sits rather uneasily with what I think you might agree has been the broad trend in professional writing of history, which is, as there become more historians, more universities, more competition for a few posts and scholarships and so on, the tendency has been to greater specialisation in order for people to carve out their own field and make a name. And obviously there are a few exceptions, yourself, Paul Kennedy and some others, who are willing to tackle the big issues, but I thought the general trend was away from looking at these large issues, but to keep one's head down and look at rather more specialised things.
Well, I think that is so, largely because of the factor we were talking about a little earlier, that now people, in order to get a meal ticket to teach
Yes.
at all, have got to do a
Yes.
thorough piece of research
Yes.
in going really deeply
Yes.
into some aspect of the past. And
Yes.
sometimes they dig themselves into a hole so deep that they never really get out of it. They just
Yes.
go on deepening.
Yes.
I did have, as indeed you did have, the first job I had to do was not research, it was lecturing.
World
over
history
fairly-
in my case, yes.
Yes. Well,
Yes,
and in doing that, one inevitably, I think, forms some kind of concept about the process of history,
Sure.
how things have led to one another, how we
Yes.
have got to where we are now.
Yes.
And I have always felt that the historians have a certain obligation to explain to the laity
Yes, indeed.
how it is that we have got to where we are now.
Yes.
How the past, without the Whig idea that the past has led inevitably to the present,
Yes,
and the
indeed.
present is the only way it could have gone.
Indeed.
Nonetheless, the past did lead to the present. The
Yes.
present has evolved out of the past.
Right.
And most people who are not professional scholarly historians are inevitably, and I think rightly, going to look to the past for some kind of explanation
Yes.
about why the world is in the state that it is today.
Yes. Rather than lessons, I think explanation is probably...
I think explanation
yes.
is the word that I would,
Yes.
I would certainly like to
Yes.
use.
Yes. I think many historians are so, I won't say intimidated, but so aware of peer pressure when they're making their names that they stick to what they think they know about. I think you've been unusual in taking this broad approach from a very early stage, and your earlier remarks about your work on the Franco-Prussian War, I think, were indicative that this opened up to you not just a specific subject, but a very wide view of what history was about and where we come from and where we were going.
Well, I was very fortunate to be in on the ground floor of a new discipline, which I could help to shape in the way in which I wanted, and without there being very many in the way of peers to criticise.
Yes, indeed.
I was extraordinarily fortunate.
Indeed. If I may just interrupt, I think the person I've been acquainted with and studied Little Heart, in a sense, was both fortunate and unfortunate in this respect too, in that if you don't have people constantly niggling at what you're doing, it gives you more sense of freedom to expand.
Yes.
On the other hand, if you don't have critics who really can tell you when you're talking nonsense or writing it,
you can become
you could get carried away, I think. Yes, indeed.
Well, I did have the advantage of working within a university environment.
And of course, regular seminars with bright young students
like yourself around, who, even if you were my pupil, were nonetheless capable of extremely shrewd comments.
Thank you. But I think looking at the other side of the coin, if coin it is, you certainly wouldn't want to be dogmatic or in any way critical of, or not very critical of, historians who do find their niche, who find some specialised field and devote most of their career to it, because it is through such work that that the subject can be developed through specialised study. I mean, if everyone were writing very broad global history, then the details of particular wars or trade conflicts wouldn't occur. And the image that many people use is that these scholars are producing building blocks in a great edifice. But I know from your writing and from talking to you that you prefer the idea of chain mail, of links in a process.
Yes. Oh, I admire them enormously, and these are, of course, most of our colleagues are like that. They're craftsmen who are doing superlative work, quite often on a fairly miniature scale. Yes. But then when you look at it, you realize that miniature as it may be, it is of enormous significance.
Yes.
And that it is only because they're doing the work that they do that you can have something like a credible larger picture to put together.
Quite. The third question I have arising from your valedictory, and I think it's a bit of a googly to bowl you towards the end, but I'm sure you can deal with it. The penultimate sentence in your valedictory is, the historical process, through the very challenges it poses and the responses it evokes, itself creates the morality of mankind. And I find that a bit puzzling, in that maybe it suggests that historians have an inbuilt sense of shared moral values, or if not, that they may acquire them through the process of study and writing. And I wonder what the nature of this morality is that could be so widely shared.
Of course, I was way out of my depth getting into the field of moral philosophy, but it does come down to the question, by what criteria do historians judge what has happened in the past? Can one legitimately condemn slavery, for example,
yes,
from outside, when it was something that was entirely accepted
yes,
over millennia as being something entirely natural?
Yes.
And now we have evolved to a different degree of moral sensibility.
Yes.
Standing apart from that, how justified are we? I mean, we're justified in judging one another and saying that torture is abominable and the Holocaust was abominable. But was Genghis Khan abominable? Was the burning of heretics abominable? Was the slave trade carried on, not only I would say by white people, but by coloured people as well? Was it abominable? If so, why did people go on doing it? Yes. This, I think historians cannot entirely dodge this dilemma about what are the criteria by which you do judge. Should one judge at all? And what I was trying to say in very digested form is that mankind, in fact, does through, as I say, the challenges, the problems which face us, gradually devise or evolve new ways of looking at the world, new kinds of moral sensibility, which I think I can say are better than those of the past.
I think you were obviously addressing these remarks to sort of liberal, democratic Western society, where by and large there is freedom to research and publish, and an open market for the discussion of ideas, whereas in quite large parts of the world, history is still really shackled to the prevailing government or religious or other point of view.
Well, I was writing out of this liberal, democratic, pluralistic society of which I am a part, and which I do feel is good.
Yes.
That, but one does confront a sort of fundamental moral dilemma of comparative moral values in the world today.
Sure.
When the Western values which we espouse are in many parts of the world seen as being evil, counterproductive, the product of a great Satan.
Yes.
But as I said, I think in my inaugural lecture, the historian cannot simply dissociate himself from all this. I mean, that we are part of a society, we are moulded by that society, and if we feel the values of that society are good, we should express them, and we should, if the worst comes to the worst, defend with physical force the society in which it is possible for those values to grow.
Yes, I hope you'd agree that it is perhaps a fault of academic writing that we tend to be very reluctant to come out and say that so-and-so is wrong, or to express a very clear view. I know you wrote a very emotional, I think, article about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and I think perhaps this is the sort of thing where we ought really to be a little more.
Well, that was a broadcast which I gave 48 hours after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and I did express a sort of the moral outrage which I and everybody else felt. But I think if you reread it, you will see that I said that, look, Soviet Union had its reasons for doing this. That it has got its own defensive hang-ups about the West. It does see itself as being under threat from the West. Its intervention in Czechoslovakia has got to be put side by side with the British intervention in Suez, or the American intervention in Vietnam. It's not a one-off piece of moral obliquity.
No, quite. No.
If you look at it in the framework of the way in which great powers do behave, there's nothing all that unusual about it.
No, indeed.
But nonetheless, it was a bad, stupid, unwise thing to do, which deserves condemnation, as indeed I condemn the British intervention at Suez.
Right. I think that leads naturally to my final question. It's partly a reflection myself, but I think there is a question in it. You spent your professional life studying war, conflict, the exercise of power. Many people think was a fairly sober undertaking. And in this discussion, we've looked at part of your interest in the liberal conscience and your origins, your family background in the milieu from which that derived. And we've looked at the other side, really. I think it's the other side of Clausewitz and the rather tough world of interstate relations. And I find there are some dark hints in, I don't think on the whole your writing is either pessimistic or optimistic, but there are some dark hints in some of your essays, and for example in your conclusion of your survey of war in European history, that there's at least one lesson from history which Western liberals and Democrats, I use those terms fairly broadly, have not really learned, and that is we, public opinion, were too apt to will good ends. One thinks of appeasement in the 30s and Bosnia now, but bulk or really hesitate over the means. My final question is really, are we still living essentially in a Clausewitzian world where the more ruthless enemy may lop off our arms if we're not prepared to defend our values?
We're still living in a very rough world, as one sees, and I see no prospect that we will ever live in a different kind of world, because, as I indicated in my valedictory, each solution that one finds creates new problems which one has got to solve. The solution of the Cold War has produced new, totally unforeseen kinds of problems. The solution of those is going to throw up still further problems.
There is no utopia to which we're headed.
There is no end to history. There's no moment when we can lie back and say we have got it made. We've got to go on struggling.
And things won't necessarily get better.
They will not necessarily get better, and once they get better, they will then create further problems which have got to be overcome also. I mean, depends what you mean by things. I mean, many things have got incomparably better.
Yes.
Not only with over the last 300 or 400 years, but during my own lifetime.
Yes.
If one looks at things like life expectancy, personal comfort, reduction of disease, improvement in all those fields is staggering.
But in other respects,
things have not got better. In other respects, they get worse. And I see no reason to expect a sort of situation which everything goes on getting infinitely better. And they will only not get worse if one goes on working very hard to ensure that they don't. You've just got to go on working at it.
I'm sure you're going to be very active, but your teaching career has come to an end. You've retired. The century itself is coming to an end, and I sense you approach it with a very open mind. You don't see this as a return to the Dark Ages, but nor do you see it as the approach to utopia.
Again, one of the things which I learned from my colleagues as historians was the Dark Ages were not all that dark.
No, and there may be more of them in the future. Yes. Michael, I shall refrain from asking you what you plan to do in your retirement and simply urge you not to lay down your pen. Enjoy your very well-earned leisure, but let someone else cultivate your garden. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, very much indeed.